接着为您播出《气候战役在台湾》。本节目由台达电子文教基金会赞助。
换装一颗 LED 灯，1年减碳70公斤；喝咖啡使用环保杯，1年减碳4.01公斤；上班出门前记得把保温电热水瓶的插头给拔掉，1年减碳157公斤。面对气候战役，对抗地球暖化，可以是个人的事，更需要政府及企业的参与。台达电子文教基金会邀您一同寻找既能提升生活品质，并可大幅提高能源使用效率的提案。欢迎收听《气候战役在台湾》。
欢迎收听《气候战役在台湾》，我是今天的代班主持人 Claire。大家如果还有印象的话，我们在前一集有邀请到了台湾大学实验林领管处处长蔡明哲，来向各位听众朋友介绍什么是 Biodiversity Credit 生物多样性额度，那企业又可以如何来对接。那目前全世界有超过50种方法学，世界各国都正在发展 Biodiversity Credit。那有这么多种不同的方法学，不就没有一个统一的准则？会不会有造成漂绿的隐忧？那买卖家又该如何确定额度能够协助保育自然？为了解决这个问题呢，其实在2022年的 COP15 上面有一个组织因此而诞生，它就是生物多样性额度联盟 Biodiversity Credit Alliance， 或我们简称的 BCA。这个组织它是由联合国环境保护总署 UNEP 所支持，它主要成立的目的就是要协助建立兼具高品质、高信度跟公平正义的生物多样性额度。那我们今天这一集呢，非常荣幸邀请到了一位重量级的来宾，他就是现任于生物多样性额度联盟全球协调员的 Manesh Lacoul。那 Manesh 要来跟我们分享，根据 BCA 的定义，什么是生物多样性额度，我们又该如何决定它的价值，买卖家有哪些需要留意的地方。那首先在开始之前，是不是能先请 Manesh 跟听众朋友打声招呼？
Greetings, listeners. Again, it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about the work that Biodiversity Credit Alliance has been doing in the last 2 years to bring integrity, equity, inclusivity, and innovation into this emerging biodiversity credit market.
首先想请教 Manesh， 我们该如何决定生物多样性额度的价值？
Before we jump into that, I think we need to first define biodiversity credits, what they are. And you may be aware that the Biodiversity Credit Alliance actually established this definition of a biodiversity credit. And this was done in a very participatory approach. It took us quite a bit of time to even come to one kind of agreed definition. But now it is established as a certificate that represents the unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is additional and durable to what would have otherwise occurred. So there are 4 terms here. One is the measured and evidence-based unit. The other one is the positive outcome, like the positive biodiversity outcome, then the durable and additional. And when we say, for instance, the measured and evidence-based unit, that's where we come as how do we measure it then? So this is what is being worked on. Like how do we ensure that the positive outcome of biodiversity is measured and it's based on evidences? And to do that, it could be, as identified in the definition issue paper, it could be done through 3 ways. One is the uplift, which is looking into restoration, right, of degraded ecosystems or landscapes. Then the second one is avoided loss. That is really looking into imminent threats, for instance, like logging, encroachment, fragmentation of ecosystems, or through through development or through farmings and so on, right? Really reducing those imminent threats. And then the third set of activities, what we call maintenance, is really looking into these ecosystems and landscapes which are intact. And when we say intact, of course, there is always a threat that in future it may come, but these are kind of long-term threats that maybe a government can give out the concession for logging or mining, or there is this kind of climate change impact which degrades it. So can we work on reducing those kind of long-term threats as well? And so these are the three types of interventions that we are looking at and defining as the ones that are key to, positive biodiversity outcome that leads to the quantification of biodiversity credits.
那 Manesh 他刚刚回答到，要能够回答这个问题，首先我们需要能够认识什么是生物多样性额度。他提到了 BCA， 他其实花了非常多的时间跟不同利害关系人讨论出生物多样性它的额度的定义，就是它其实是一种凭证，它是经过测量跟证据支持，能够带给生物多样性正面影响。那这个影响是长久，而且它具外加性，也就是说这个正面的影响不是本来就会发生。那它在定义当中也提到了4个名词，包含了对生物多样性的影响、可测量跟以证据为基础、持久性跟外加性。那从定义延伸出去看，生物多样性它的正面影响会取决于3种我们采取的手段。第一种是提升，也就是恢复我们目前已经退化的生态系或自然景观。那第二种则是避免损失，是针对一些迫在眉睫的威胁，例如砍伐森林啊、土地侵占、生态系破碎化，去减少这些即将发生的威胁。第三种则是维护，也就是说保护我们目前仍然完好的生态系跟自然景观。那当然我们说完好的时候，并不是说这些地方永远不会受到影响，而是指这些没有直接的威胁，但可能未来也可能会有，因此我们需要减少这类长期的风险。第二个问题，那既然生物多样性额度的价值跟前面提到的3种手段相关，那接着想请教 Manesh， 我们怎么样知道多大程度的人为劳动会等于多少的信用额度？
Yeah, I mean, carbon market has been very fungible. I mean, 1 ton of carbon emission is same no matter where it is on this earth. But biodiversity, as you know, from the name itself, it's diverse, right? So there's so much of diversity, even from the same jurisdictional area. I mean, there are so many different kind of ecosystems that we may be looking at in one particular country itself. So how do we quantify biodiversity is the question. And for that, of course, we may not have one, standard approach to do it, because we may have to look at different ways to measure that, right? But then how do we make sure that they are comparable, the question. Now, can we have a standard? Yes, there are standards like organizations like Plan Vivo Foundation, Vera, Gold Standard, Carbono, Biocarbon. So there are Regen Network. So there are all these different institutions who are working towards coming up with standards towards biodiversity credit. But then we have at least now over 50 different methodologies which are being piloted or are being developed both on land and in water, which looks at probably restoration to, threat reduction to maintenance as well. So the point is, now, can we say, no, we should follow just one specific standard? Perhaps not. It's not like in carbon. Though carbon has, a fungible token, but there are different methodologies, right? And different standards for that as well. But biodiversity credits, the more question is that do we need one specific, approach or one specific unit for measuring biodiversity gain? Perhaps not, right? We can see markets which has these different types of products. For instance, if we can, just to simplify, let's say we're looking at an auto market. There are so many different kinds of cars out there in the market, and they meet the needs of different buyers or different customers. So there is a Toyota, there's a Tesla, and there's a BYD, and there's a Mercedes, and of course Maserati, right? So someone may want, let's say, a Maserati of biodiversity credits, if we may call it so. Someone may say, okay, the Toyota of biodiversity credits fit into their kind of strategies. So at this moment, it's very early on for the market. There are so many different approaches. All are being piloted, tested. And we are also seeing convergences across different methodologies, for instance, because we have a methodology, a project developer called Credit Nature based out of the UK. And then we have one Value Nature based out of South Africa. And they realized, the approaches and so on are similar. So they kind of merged themselves. So, over time, I think the market will emerge in a way that will make, more kind of convergence of different methods and different standards. But we'll have to just wait and see, I would say.
Yeah.
But at this stage where we are, I think it's good because we want to see innovation coming into space as well, but with, of course, integrity.
然后 Manesh 回答第二个问题，对于这个问题，我们目前没有办法用单一的标准化来做计算，我们需要考量不同的测量方法。但 Manesh 有提出，关键的地方是在于我们如何确保这些不同的测量方式是可以比较的。那我们能够制定一个统一的标准吗？那事实上，在一刚开始也有提到，其实目前市场上的确有一些标准，很多机构都正在努力建立生物多样性额度的标准。那目前全球有超过50种，涵盖陆地啊、水域等等的。那我们应该只能遵循单一标准吗？其实可能不行。生物多样性额度它涉及到许多不同的方法跟标准，但更重要的是，我们真的需要把这样子一个单一的方式或单位来衡量生物多样性的正面价值吗？也许不需要。Manesh 他提出，我们可以把这个市场有点想象成是一个汽车市场，比如说在这个市场当中有很多不同的品牌，有 Toyota， 有 Tesla， 有 Maserati， 供买家自由挑选。那买家他可以根据自己的策略去选购自己适合的额度。那以目前来说，这个市场还正在早期阶段，有许多不同的方法也正在试验跟测试当中。我们其实也开始看到一些方法在融合，例如英国的 Credit Nature 跟南非的 Value Nature， 这两家机构因为发现他们的方法跟理念都相似，所以选择合并。所以 Manesh 他有讲到，长久来看，市场它其实还是可能逐渐迈向标准化，让不同的方法跟标准更加融合。那这个其实还需要一些时间来观察。那我们希望说，在这个领域未来能够有创新，但同时我们也需要确保这些创新是符合诚信跟可信度的。如果买家他没有任何的生物学背景，要如何知道购买什么样子的生物多样性额度？那是否又有第三方认证机构验证额度呢？
Yeah, I think there are a couple of components in your question there. So as you were talking about how can buyer know, what kind of credit to purchase? And one thing I just wanted to highlight here that, as we are talking of integrity on the supply side, but we are talking of integrity in the overall market, so from the supply side to the buyer side as well. And we hope, and this is our intention, and that's what we are working on, the buyers, when they come to the market, they do not come just like, okay, today I woke up and then I thought, okay, I should buy some biodiversity credit, so I would like to buy. No, that's not what it should be, right? Before the buyers decide purchasing biodiversity credits, they should do some homework beforehand. This is where we are trying to set it a slightly, again, learning lessons from the carbon market. So trying to say there should be some kind of guardrails there as well. So for instance, you may have heard of the Task Force for nature-related financial disclosures, or TNFD, which is more about really understanding the impacts and the dependencies of the private sector based on their operation, their supply chain, and all that. Then you may have heard of the Science-Based Targets Network, or SBTN, which is more on setting strategies, nature strategies, or nature positive strategies. So the concept should be that, if a potential buyer wants to jump into biodiversity credits purchase or any kind of nature positive investments, then they should look at what their initial impacts are, and then their dependencies are, and look at the risks and opportunities, right? The TNFD LEAF framework. And then they should perhaps move on to SBTN, the Science-Based Targets Network, and set the strategies or the targets, right? And within that target, look into where biodiversity credits fit in. Maybe for some, it may not fit in, looking at the supply chains and operations and whatnot. But for some, it may fit in right there as a major chunk of the work they do. So then they can say, okay, based on the homework, what we've done, we see biodiversity credits actually fit in here. Mm-hmm. And this kind of biodiversity credit is what we want to buy. And then, they come and say, okay, now we are ready to buy biodiversity credits. Mm-hmm. Now that's one point.
那么那是他回答，其实需要将这个问题拆成3个部分。首先，买家在购买 Biodiversity Credit 的时候，本来就应该会先做好事前的功课，他不是某一天睡觉起来就突然梦到自己要买额度。那么那是他举例，比如说买家他在事前会先用 TNFD 去检视自身营运对于生物多样性可能造成的依赖性跟影响，再透过 SBTN 去检视合适的策略跟手段，以降低风险。那当然他在检视的过程当中，他可能会考量很多不同的方法，那或许 Biodiversity Credit 是一个很适合的手段。那如果是的话，接下来这个买家才会再更进一步去看说 OK， 那有这么多 Biodiversity Credit， 哪一种最适合我们，接着才会选择购买。
The other point you're asking is about the analogy of the auto market. Now there are so many different biodiversity credits out there. How can a buyer compare? For auto market, of course, there are certain standards, right? The dimensions of the vehicle, to its power, to its safety features. There are certain standards that we look at. So we want to make sure that the different biodiversity credits are sort of comparable as well. And as you mentioned, Kali, so we presented a paper, what we call the comparability framework of metrics. So we have come up with, and when we say we, so this is the BCA community, not just BCA secretariat, but it's the community that helped shape this, a comparability framework, I think with 26 criteria to look into each different methodology and help come up with kind of a standard sheet where, a buyer can put okay, we have methodology from X, methodology from Y, methodology from Z, and we are looking at the metrics and then say, okay, this one is saying per hectare, this one is saying per 10 square meters, this one is saying 1 square kilometer. So how can we compare them? So that kind of work is being done, and the paper will be released soon as well.
那面对市场上有这么多不同的生物多样性额度，买家又该如何购买，如何比较？那么 Nash 就有提到了 BCA 社群在去年 COP30 生物多样性大会上首先宣布接下来会出版 Comparability Framework of Metrics， 也就是指标比较的框架。那这个框架它会罗列出26种指标去检视不同的方法学，好协助买家比较跟决定要购买哪一种。那么 Nash 也透过这次的这个大会来分享说，这个 paper 预计将在近期发表。
The audit part, right? So then comes the integrity. So auditing or third-party verification is a key to all these projects, because we want to make sure that the projects that are generating these credits are durable and additional, so that the actual credits can be attributed to the project intervention, right? So there are like standards like Plan Vivo, for instance. They have come up with their standard. And then Vera and a group of other institutions have developed the nature framework. Similarly, there are lots of other different standards that are out there. And I mean, these are all being developed, but they're looking at third-party verification based on their accredited independent institutions, which look at maybe 5 years of audit. Right? Plus, of course, regular monitoring, maybe every year or every second year, and all that. So all these are being put in place to ensure that the actual credits that are being generated are attributed to the project that's generating or claiming to generate those credits, plus also that they are durable. You know, it should not be that, okay, they are generating and 5 years down the line, the project is not impactful at all. We want to make sure that the credits are constantly generated and whatever is done is durable in the long run. So there are different countries which are saying, like, I think it's in the US, they're saying it should be 99 years. In UK, I think 30 years, you know, so there are all these different timelines. But we haven't really defined a specific timeline because we need to be sensitive towards the territories of indigenous peoples and local communities as well. But we have simply said that the project should be durable. I think over time there will be more kind of lessons and knowledge generated that can help shape it further.
那为了确保产生的额度具有持久性、外加性，而且有助于生物多样性，但目前有许多不同的单位正在发展标准，像是 Plan Vivo、Vera 等等。那这些机构也同时正在寻求第三方认证单位。这些单位会定期的去检视这些方法学，好确保产生的这个额度它是具有正面影响，而且是长期性的。那么 Manesh 就提到，比如说像是目前美国它认定的方法学就判定说，我这个方法学发展出来，它对于生物多样性带来正面影响至少应该要有99年以上的正面价值。那英国则是定30年。可是 Manesh 也提醒，这个年份的设计我们必须要很小心，因为在生物多样性的场域当中，它其实同时还需要去兼顾到原住民族跟在地社群。但无论如何，最重要的还是在于它的持久性。不过 Manesh 他有讲到说，随着时间越长，我们其实学习到的经验跟知识也越能够有助于我们在未来的调整跟发展。既然提到了这些标准应该要由认证机构稽核，那事实上在去年 COP16 BCA 同样发布了一份高阶准则。那这份准则是由 BCA 以及 IAPB， 也就是由英国跟法国政府所支持的国际生物多样性额度咨询小组 International Advisory Panel of Biodiversity Credit 或我们简称的 IAPB， 以及 WEF 世界经济论坛在咨询各个不同就非常多利害关系人后所共同订定的。那是不是也能够请 Manesh 跟听众朋友介绍一下这是什么样的一个准则，然后有哪一些重点
？Yeah, I mean, this paper on the high-level principles was the first paper that the three institutions or three bodies, BCA, IAPB, which is the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, backed by the UK and the French government, and of course the World Economic Forum, jointly worked and produced a paper. And what we did, just a bit of background, is that we did not invent these principles. What we did is we really took what was out there. Like the WEF had a discussion paper that they launched in CBD COP15 in Montreal. Pretty much high-level principles, but a discussion paper. Then, since then, there were a lot of other institutions who have come up with their own set of principles, right? I mean, the standards, they have their own principles as well. And then we looked at even what was coming from the carbon space, like there is ICVCM, there's ICROA, there is, VCMI. So what we did is we really brought all of these together, analyzed them, consolidated them, and consulted across the community, and then presented these. So these principles are supposed to be sort of a guidance for the actors in the space, that what are these principles at a fairly high level that we consider critical or important for the actors to follow. So there were 21 principles which, under these high-level principles, and they were categorized into 3 types. So one is the verified positive outcome for nature. So really looking at a set of 10 principles which ensures pretty much what you were talking about, that the credits that are being generated are properly attributed to where they were coming from, and that there was no leakage, there was proper MRV, there were proper objectives established right in the beginning, also looking into tracking the issuance of credits, there were all those. And also one other important part was the demand integrity and the mitigation hierarchy, right? So that was looking at the verified positive outcome for nature. The second pillar was what we call equity and fairness for people. And again, having learned the lessons from the carbon space, we know that indigenous peoples and local communities are key to success of any project, especially, at the local level, right? And then also we know that the indigenous peoples and local communities have been the stewards of nature, because we know that most of the intact ecosystems, for instance, are protected by indigenous peoples and local communities. I mean, the statistics says something like 80% of the biodiversity is in the indigenous peoples and local communities' lands and so on. So then we need to make sure that they are not left out, not just from receiving the benefits. That's what the carbon market does. Okay, they are beneficiaries and there are challenges in that process as well. But they should be partners in this process, not just when the market is set, but right from the beginning when the conversation around market is happening, right? So that's why we established a indigenous peoples and local communities independent body called Communities Advisory Panel, which actually now, based on the conversations in Cali, are evolving into international environmental guardianship. And they are really trying to play an active role in this to really make sure that, the projects that are coming are respecting, for instance, the customary rights, for instance, the human rights, for instance, the FPIC, looking at really the rights of nature kind of concepts, and having proper benefit sharing and grievance mechanism processes in place and all that. So this is to make sure that indigenous peoples and local communities are not left out of this market. Then the third one is looking into the good governance of the market itself, and looking at how do we ensure good governance, looking at transparency, for instance, in terms of the governance structure, looking at data sovereignty, because if we are looking at data coming from indigenous peoples and local communities territories, so we cannot just go and grab that data. They have the right to hold that data, and what data they would like to share, it's up to them. So we have to respect that. Also, alignment with frameworks, like every country now, they're building their own NBSAPs, designing their own NBSAPs, right? The national biodiversity action plans and strategies. Or, we have this global biodiversity framework at the global level. So how do these, outcomes fit into those bigger pictures at national level, regional level, and global level? And also looking into tradability of credits, for instance. I mean, we are not talking about a secondary market at this stage, but over time, it may emerge. And then how do we ensure that, the speculations are also made with integrity so that, any secondary sales should channel at least a portion of the resources back to the communities where the actual credits are being generated. These principles are pretty much trying to help set these kind of guidelines for the actors, like the standards and the methodologies to follow.
那 Manesh 就提到说，事实上这项报告并不是由 BCA 发展而成，它其实是参考许多机构所提出的标准，像是 WEF 所发布的讨论文件，然后自愿性碳市场诚信委员会，或者是 ICROA 国际碳减碳抵消联盟他们所发布的文件所整理出来的21项准则。那这21项准则又可以被分成3大支柱，分别包含了对自然可验证的正向影响，也就是说我们在这个生物信用额度机制发展出来的时候，我们要如何去证明它的确能够有效的去对于生物多样性带来正面的效果。那以及第2个支柱是公平正义，也就是我们要去强调在过程当中应该要确保原住民族跟在地社群的权利跟权益受到保障，然后他们也必须要在市场建立的初期参与讨论，跟第3个需要有良好的治理机制。那这3个支柱被建立出来，同时也需要去跟各个国家的 NBCP， 就是各个国家的生物多样性框架跟政策对齐，同时需要跟全球区域性、地区性不同的政策跟这个法令去结合。那虽然 Manesh 他提到说目前还没有谈到刺激市场，就是我们在碳权当中很常也会去提到 secondary market，但可以预测随着时间演进，刺激市场的确会出现。那如何确保刺激市场的交易具备公信力，那这个部分就会等到后面再进行发展。这边想请教 Manesh 会如何建议使用这一份准则。
Yeah, I mean, the principles, definitely to look into the principles first of all.
Yes.
And also we are working on some kind of supplements to these principles, because these principles are not complete in themselves. So for instance, we have a working group on marine biodiversity credits, and earlier you talked about Taiwan's restoration of coral reef. So we know that marine ecosystems are slightly more complicated because of additionality. How do we measure it, right? Looking at MRV again, like how do we generate the data? It's in a constant flux. How about ownership? And then comes the benefit sharing. So it's more complicated, and we knew that there were limitations to these principles during the consultation process. And one of the issues that were kind of highlighted that we should work on some additional requirements to consider for marine ecosystems, and that's why we have a working group on that. Then we have another working group which is discussing on the integrity for demand, because the principles touches upon the demand integrity, but it's not enough. So we are trying to dive a bit deeper into the demand side and say perhaps look into the different use cases of these credits, right? It could be compensation, it could be contribution, it could be compliance, but how are these use cases defined? Looking into who the buyers are, like have they done their homework or not, and then looking into what kind of claims are the buyers going to make out of those credits. So really trying to not to police the buyers, but to make it easy for them to make the decisions and come into the space with assurance that what they are doing is going to be not like what happened in the carbon space, where there is the kind of claims of greenwashing and green hashing and so on. So just really trying to help build the confidence so that the suppliers and the buyers and the indigenous peoples and local communities could come to a level playing field with certain rules in place that, okay, they're all protected in their own areas. So these are the different work that we are doing parallel now. And in maybe a month's time, we will be officially launching the high-level principles, because we just presented it in Cali and then we kept it up for kind of feedback and also endorsements. So some institutions have endorsed. But then now what we really want to do is, the next step is create an integrity oversight mechanism. And when we say we create, we will be initiating the consultation or the discussions around, okay, what kind of integrity oversight mechanism do we need in this space? And then these high-level principles will be converted into an assessment framework so that the different methodologies, different standards could look into those principles and say, okay, to what level do their methods or their standards align to those principles. But these, again, within BCA, we do everything in a very consultative, very participatory way, so it takes time. So for now, as we discussed in Geneva beginning of this month, we want to come up with an assessment framework, but self-assessment framework, so that people could voluntarily pick up these their respective standards or methodologies and then say, okay, principle 1, does it, in a scale of 1 to 10, where are you? Maybe 10, maybe 1, maybe 5. And then why do you think you are there? So they can do the self-assessment, but then we will engage a third party to validate it. So that means we may, by end of the year, if not earlier, have a list of, let's say, standards and methods which are like well aligned with these principles. So that if someone is looking into credits or developing projects of their own, they can already look at, okay, what methodologies are already listed as green, aligned with the high-level principles, what standards are there. So it becomes easier for actors to really pick them up and move forward.
Manesh 提到肯定是要看这份准则，那不过目前 BCA 也正在发展其他的补充资料，因为高阶准则其实是有它的限制性，它没有办法涵盖到各个层面。Manesh 就举例，比如说海洋生态系它比较复杂，那 BCA 就要特别去针对海洋生态系设一个海洋工作小组，去探讨如何衡量海洋的外加性、生成的数据资料以及如何验证。那 BCA 他们本身也有成立了一个主要是聚焦在买方诚信的工作小组，包含如何要透过补偿、合规、回馈机制，并了解什么样的人他可能是潜在的买家，那去判断说，这些买家他在事前是不是有做足了功课，他们所宣称希望能够透过生物信用额度达到什么样的目的，是不是如真的他们所说。那这么做其实并不是要去规范买家，而是要让他们更容易做决定，不重蹈碳权的覆辙。那所以他们是BCA 的角度来看的话，是真的很希望供应商，就是买家跟卖方，还有 IPOC 原住民族跟在地社群能够建立信心，能够来到有一个公平竞争且具有规范的市场，也同时让他们知道说他们是受到保护的。那在去年的生物多样性大会之后，接下来他们会正式的发布这个高阶文件。然后在生物多样性大会上，他们同时也是希望说能够吸取各方的意见跟支持，接下来要透过咨询讨论建立一个诚信的监管机制。那这项机制它会被转换成审查的框架，让各个不同的利害关系人能够去进行自我审查。比如说我目前是在 这个什么样子的状态底下，我们是不是要来邀请第三方的机构来进行审核？如果说年度结束之前，或者是更早之前，BCA 希望能够发展出一个名单，罗列所有的准则跟对接的标准还有方法学，提供给所有的大众。那如果说现在有卖家他希望能够找到适合的额度，或者是希望发展他们的额度，那他就可以知道说目前市场上是有哪一些方法学可以参考，而且它是符合高阶准则，能够让他们继续往下发展。想请教 Manesh， 这个世界上是不是会至少有196种方法学？
Well, it depends on what do you mean by tons of
at least
biodiversity credits.
Yeah.
But do you mean
like at least 196?
Based on the members of
based on the member of the country
who agreed to the global biodiversity framework. I mean, well, we hope not.
We hope not, really?
Yeah, because if every country, for instance, because you're looking at jurisdictional basis, right? So okay, I mean, UK has their own biodiversity net gain, right?
Yeah.
Well, similarly, I mean, Finland is working on their own kind of methodology or framework and so on. But there are lots of other independent institutions who are developing these different methodologies. And these methodologies could apply for different types of ecosystems or different kinds of contexts. So, there are, for instance, governments who are already looking at these methodologies that's out there, standards that's out there, and say, what fits us better in what context? So there is that assessment already happening, right? What is appropriate for them? So there are those who go on developing different kinds of methodologies for different contexts. But then there are those who are saying, okay, what can we make the most out of what's out there? So, I mean, we may not end up with, 196 different methodologies based on the jurisdictions, but then we may end up with, the type of quantification that different gains may require, right? And as I mentioned earlier, that there are like over 50 different methodologies now.
Yeah.
But then there are convergences happening as well. And so yeah, it's hard to say, but I really hope that not every country will come up with their own methodologies or frameworks. But that's where BCA is as well, to support that kind of work, that what is out there, really trying to help disseminate it and raise awareness around it. So
it sounds like an interaction between the BCA and the world, like just like what you mentioned, like through the consultation and discussion paper by the IAPB and WEF, we see what's on the ground and what are their focus and what need to include into the principle as well. So it's like a mutual and dynamic. Yeah, that's
what we would like to stay. I mean, because we are backed by the UN, so we are very neutral. So we want to make sure that we can get as many actors coming in and helping shape up all these principles and guidances and definitions that we are working on. And what we really are saying is that the high-level principles are at the stage where we are launching it, but they will not be, they may change in next 5 years' time. So these are like a living document, and we'll be revisiting it over time to refine them further based on the lessons that we the lessons that emerge from the market.
Manesh 的回复是希望并不是这么一回事，因为目前虽然说英国跟芬兰都正在发展自己的方法学，那市场上同时也有很多不同的研究机构，像是 Vera 等等的正在发展生物多样性信用额度的机制，可是这些机制它其实是用在不同的生态系、 不同的框架底下。因此对于正在寻找方法学的政府当中，他们一定是先看看目前市场上有哪一些方法学能够最适合他们。所以他们本身这些方法学并不是针对于哪一些国家来进行发展，当然他们会希望说他们可以透过哪一些方法学达到他们希望达到的效果。Manesh 也分享，目前全球有超过50多种方法，那并不是说他们希望每个国家都有一个自己的方法学，那这也是 BCA 存在的目的，他们要去建立一个规范跟建立一个准则，去支持这样子的工作，并且把这样子的知识分享，然后散播出去，并提升更多人对生物多样性信用额度的了解。但BCA 他们是由这个联合国所支持，所以他们希望可以有更多成员加入，然后一起创造出准则、标准跟定义。所以这个标准本身是活的，它需要被检视，并且根据学习到的教训跟经验，大概约每5年去优化一次。那这边想请教 Manesh， 在生物多样性大会上，我们听到了很多来自于原住民族跟在地社群表示，为什么不要直接把资金投注到他们身上，而是需要透过像生物多样性信用额度这样子的手段达到？那您怎么看呢？
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what we saw in Cali. There were the proponents and the opponents of biodiversity credit, and a lot of that, I think, this kind of divergent views come from some misunderstanding as well, I would say. And that's what we are there to clarify, that, I mean, a lot of it is coming from, for instance, the concept that biodiversity credits will be used to offset impacts. And we are saying that offsetting requires a certain, different or more stricter principles to follow, like what we call the ecological equivalence. So it has to be same to same or like to like. So biodiversity credits, again, we are working with the community on defining the use cases and so on, and what is possible and what is not possible. But as I mentioned to you, we have this communities advisory panel, which recently evolved into international environmental guardianship. And that in itself says a lot, right? Because what we want to do is for the communities and the indigenous peoples to be in the driver's seat where appropriate to set up these projects and run themselves. In other words, you were referring to what we call the direct access to finance. So biodiversity credits could be one of the tools that gives direct access to finance to indigenous peoples and local communities, because they are the ones, as you said, in the front line, right? They are the ones who are the stewards. So they are the best position and perhaps most knowledgeable as well, because they have this intergenerational knowledge of conservation, not just for materialistic reasons, but spiritual reasons, right? Religious reasons, So biodiversity credits can actually help channel the funds directly to the communities. I mean, if we look at a lot of the projects that are being developed, I think 50 to 60% of the revenues go back to the communities. Now, this is sort of unheard of in the carbon space, but we know that indigenous peoples and local communities own the territories, right? So they probably have the right to those projects, and they own the data. So they need to be respected for that. They have the traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, which needs to be respected as well. And there are conversations happening of how we can mainstream them. How can we, for instance, bring the indigenous people's knowledge and traditional knowledge into a kind of process to triangulate with science, because they have been effective stewards of nature. So how can we bring that? So I see biodiversity credits as a totally different tool than what is being contested, because, there is still lack of knowledge and misconceptions among certain groups of people. But we appreciate it, we respect it, everyone has their own views. But with the work on integrity, with the work on, really advancing indigenous peoples and local communities in the conversation of shaping the market and actually developing projects at the grassroots level is what we're really trying to do, which means the funds will eventually be channeled to indigenous peoples and local communities, most of it. Right? And then we are having, within UNDP also, we are having conversations. For instance, there are other mechanisms within UNDP, like we have the UNDP Jeff Small Grants Program, which has been working with communities for last, I don't remember the exact year, I think 30 years or so, right? And what they do is they provide funding directly to the communities or the civil society organizations or community-based organizations to make things happen. And we're looking at ways to channel funds to community-led biodiversity credit projects through, for instance, this kind of mechanism of Jeff Small Grants Program.
I see.
So, my view is yes, they are pretty much a tool which can help channel the funds to the communities rather than the other way around. So.
Manesh 的回答是，其实这是来自于很多对于这个 Biodiversity Credit 的误解，那这也是为什么 BCA 要澄清这些误会。那他认为，之所以会有这些歧见，是主要很多人都会误以为说，我要有一个这样的机制来去抵消企业或者是一些利害关系人对环境造成的负面影响。但是 Manesh 提出，如果要透过抵消的方式，它会需要有一个更加严格的规范，例如像生态等值 ecological equivalence 的方式去判断是否可以用来抵消。那 BCA 目前正在跟在地社群合作订定规范，希望能够透过原住民族跟在地社群去自己参加决策，并不是把他们排除在外。那至于先前提到说为什么不把资金直接挹注到原住民族跟在地社群呢？ Manesh 他强调，生物多样性信用额度其实是一项工具，是可以达到生物多样性保护的手段。如果你目前来看一下现在现有的专案，其实大概市面上很多专案它其实都有要求 50% 到 60% 的利润是规定一定要流入到，就是回馈给原住民族跟在地社群。那 BCA 也希望说能够透过建立具有诚信的机制，将原住民族跟在地社群纳入对话，发展草根层级的生物多样性信用额度机制。那这边想请教 Manesh， 是不是接下来会有全球性的生物多样性额度呢？
Yeah, so in terms of the biodiversity credits, where is it going? It's already agreed by and it's Article 19D, Target 19D, which specifically mentions biodiversity credits. So it's out there, and it's sort of like the genie is out of the bottle. Now, how do we sort of manage the genie is, I think, the key question. So I see it as picking up because, BCA launched in Montreal in 2022. And now where we are today, 2 years down the line, slightly more than 2 years down the line, is we are more than 500 members strong body. So also this includes private sector, banks, both, private banks or multilateral banks and so on. And then, of course, the communities, other actors who are helping on the supply side, so academics. So this is like ever expanding community, which means there is so much of interest. So one way it shows is if we can, really manage it well, then it's going to go well with good benefits to people and to planet, right? But that's where we really need to come together to help shape it, learning lessons from the carbon space as well. And if we compare it with what happened in the carbon space, it took some time for the carbon market to pick up. There were these early years when it was like very stagnant, very limited transactions. But we saw like after 2015, the market really shot up. Right? So this is this phase that we are looking at as well. And this came up in our meetings in Geneva, that perhaps we are going through that phase like a kind of hockey stick kind of chart. So we are seeing gradual increase in interest, and we're trying to channel it in the right way to pass the right message, and then it may shoot up. So we're just preparing for that by the time that shoot up comes, the supply side actors are prepared. The indigenous peoples and local communities are well, empowered. The buyers are well informed. And then comes the governments. They are well prepared as well, because we need proper policies, proper regulations, proper institutions in place to make sure that all of these go in the right direction. So one of the work that we are doing is also on innovation, like the digital representation, one of the papers we presented in Cali. So that has been sent out for consultation with the community now. And maybe in 3 weeks' time or so, we will be coming out with it. So how can we, really found or establish the market on a digital framework? That brings in transparency, brings auditability and scalability with it. So, the idea is really to channel it in the right path. Yeah. Because we know growth is coming, but we want to make sure that growth happens in the right path.
那Manesh提到，在2022年的时候，昆明蒙特楼全球生物多样性框架的目标19第1项已经提到了生物多样性信用额度。那2022年 BCA 也在蒙特楼在生物多样性大会上成立。回望过去的2年，其实 BCA 目前已经是拥有超过500个成员的组织，那其中不乏包含了私人机构啊、银行、原住民族跟在地社群、学者，还有各个利害关系人。那生物多样性信用额度机制在发展过程当中，其实会很需要向碳权的经验中学习。其实我们看到了2015年之后，碳权它其实有一个很急速的飙升，那这个也是目前 BCA 正在准备的。他们有观察到，其实有越来越多人表示有兴趣。那买家、卖家、原住民族跟在地社群，还有包含政府，都需要为了这个未来可以预期到的快速成长来好好应对，因为我们会需要合适的政策、法规跟机构，让确保这个机制是朝向正确的方向发展。那发展的过程当中也需要创新，透过数位科技去达到透明、当责性跟可量化性。那么 Manesh 最后就表示说，对于快速成长的未来，我们目前是需要去确保它当成长发生时，我们在正确的道路上。最后一个问题想请教 Manesh， BCA 的下一步是什么
？Yeah, so I think one of the things that came out of the Geneva meeting was that we need to focus quite a bit on demand. That how do we generate demand? And for me, I would say more than generate demand, generate the right kind of demand. That's very important, right? We don't want just any kind of demand. Like, someone coming and saying, okay, I wake up this morning, as we talked earlier, that, okay, I want to buy biodiversity credits because I dreamt this in my dream. No, it shouldn't be like that. So how can we make sure that there is integrity in demand? How can we make sure that there are, proper indication of biodiversity credits? For instance, TNFD's discussion paper on nature transition plans talks about biodiversity credits. So it is a tiny little step, but important one, because now the paper is saying, okay, biodiversity credits are out there as well. Something to watch out. And that's where we need to do quite a lot of work, is to make sure that we have all the necessary guardrails, all the necessary guidances, all the necessary support in place for buyers to be confident and step into the market as well.
Yeah. Manesh 他分享了2025年3月才刚在日内瓦结束的会议，那主要聚焦在如何确保说我们能够催生出正确的需求，不是随便的买家，而是正确的买家。那这是什么意思呢？就是说对 BCA 来讲，他下一步需要的是知道说我们的需求方，我们的买家是否也具备了诚信，并不是某一天睡觉起来突然想要购买生物多样性信用额度。那另外还有包含要提升民众或者是大家对于生物多样性信用额度的理解。那么Manesh就提到，其实 TNFD 在他的文件当中有提到生物多样性信用额度，那这个对于 BCA 来说就是前进了一步，因为这让大家知道说BCA 让大家留意到生物多样性信用额度。不过Manesh也提到说，未来还会需要更多的工作准则跟协助，好让买家有自信能够踏入这个市场。那今天真的非常感谢 Manesh 来到我们节目当中，那也希望我们的听众朋友能够透过我们与 Manesh 的访谈，能够更了解生物多样性信用额度如何运作，那未来有哪一些准则可以协助买卖双方、政府跟这个原住民族跟在地社群在踏入市场的过程当中是更具备信心，也能够知道说有哪一些工具可以来协助他们达到保护生物多样性的需求。今天节目到这边，好，谢谢大家收听。
以上节目由台达电子文教基金会独家赞助播出。台达电子文教基金会邀您一起环保节能爱地球。